Welcome. It is Verdict with Senator Ted Cruz, Ben Ferguson with you, and we are back to regularly scheduled programming after what was really cool, a two-part sit-down, Senator, that you did with Clarence Thomas. Now it's my turn to get to talk to you about how fun it was to do this project and to write about someone that you had so much admiration for.
Well, this has been a terrific week. On Tuesday, my brand new book came out, Going Further, the Incomparable Clarence Thomas. And it's my fifth book. This one has really been a labor of love. I've loved writing it. It came out on Tuesday. It immediately rocketed to being the #1 bestseller in the country on Amazon. It has been incredible. I want to start by saying to Verdict listeners, to all of you, thank you. Thank you for going onto Amazon and buying the book. Thank you for going. We have a website, goingfurther.com. Thank you for buying the book. There's been a lot of enthusiasm behind it, and Monday and Wednesday's pods were really special because Justice Thomas came and I had the chance to interview him one-on-one for the podcast. This was the first and it's the only podcast Justice Thomas has ever done. So he has done Verdict and nothing else. And it was, Justice Thomas and I go back more than 30 years. He is a good friend, and I think he is truly an American hero. But he very rarely does interviews. He does very few public speeches. And so for him to come and participate in Verdict and answer questions and just talk candidly about his life, about his childhood, his upbringing, talk about his ideological and intellectual journey, talk about his jurisprudence, talk about the demonization and vilification that has been directed at him. And it's, I got to say, the interview with Justice Thomas broke a ton of news. There have been dozens and dozens of news stories, national news stories that came out of that podcast. Because Justice Thomas does so few interviews, and because when he sat down on Verdict, he was very honest and candid and direct, and so he spoke from the heart. I will say, if you didn't watch that whole video, it's two parts. Monday was part 1, Wednesday was part 2. You should go back and watch it because it really does give you. I know the man, I know him personally, but I will say that interview now ranks right up there with the interview you and I did with Elon Musk as among my favorite podcasts we've ever done. And so I would encourage you, make sure you watch it and share that interview with others, and hopefully this one too, as we talk more about the book, which we're going to do right now.
Yeah, it's really awesome. All right, I want to take a moment real quick and talk to you about something that's extremely important. Right now, somewhere in the world, there's a child waiting. Not waiting for a birthday, not waiting for Christmas, but waiting for someone just like you to choose them. That's what Compassion International does every single day. They connect children living in poverty with someone who will know their name, who will pray for them, who will encourage them, and help provide the food, the medical care, the education, and the hope they need through a local church. Now, this year, Compassion is expanding into 4 new countries: Malawi, Zambia, Cambodia, and Myanmar, meaning thousands of children are being reached, which is incredible, for the very first time. And I want you to join me for just $43 a month. You can be the reason one child stops waiting. Sponsor a child today at compassion.com. That's compassion.com. All right, Senator, so let's just go back in time and let people understand, like, when this became an idea to do the biography of Clarence Thomas. I remember we were at dinner in D.C., and we were talking about your next book idea, subjects, topics, ideas. And then you grinned and you said, all right, what do you think about me doing a book interviewing Clarence Thomas? And usually, I remember we were sitting around, it was a small group, and it was like, well, that's not normally what you do. And then you sold us on the idea because it's a subject, it's going into midterm election year, it'd be something that would be important to what's happening now. And you're like, no, let me tell you why I think this book would be amazing and why I think people would want to read it. And you sold us because we were not convinced in that moment without the details and background. And watching, just seeing your passion that night turn into the hours you spent with Clarence Thomas, turning into this best-selling book, I got to say, from sitting on the sidelines, it has been so fun to watch.
This has been it's been a passion project, and we came up with the ideas about 2 years ago. I was thinking about, all right, I want to do another book, and I like writing books. I enjoy it. This is book number 5, so I've done one about every couple of years, and it takes a ton of time. You have to carve out a lot of time, and I do a lot of late nights. If I'm not doing Verdict in late nights, I'm writing the book. That's you can tell I have an exciting social life. It's really impressive. But I like writing books. I was looking for a topic and something I wanted to say, and what got me excited about this biography is Clarence Thomas is someone who I think is genuinely an American hero. He's an extraordinary person. And his life journey is so inspirational. It's so powerful. But yet most people don't know it. Most Americans, It's interesting that this week I'm doing a ton of media interviews. And almost to a person, the folks doing the interviews, they say, well, when I read this book, I learned a ton of things that I didn't know. I didn't know this about Clarence Thomas. I didn't know that about Clarence Thomas. And I want every American to know his story and to know both his personal story of going from abject poverty, facing massive racism, all the way up to the pinnacle of American law. That is an inspirational and amazing story. But I also want people to understand the intellectual journey he traveled from being a hardcore leftist, a radical leftist student activist.
He was an OG activist, by the way.
Yeah.
Like, people don't understand. He was an old school college activist, and talk about a 180, a radical, yeah.
Yeah, and all the way to being one of the most important conservative thinkers in the history of America. That's an amazing journey too, and it's important to understand. And then third, his jurisprudence. So Clarence Thomas is right now the second longest serving justice in American history. In less than 2 years, he will become the longest serving justice in the history of the United States. That's a big damn deal. And
by the way, who is the longest serving? Because that's got to be a history question people are asking right now.
It's not. You're the first to ask that. The longest serving is William O. Douglas.
Interesting.
And Thomas will pass him, I think, in May of 28.
Wow.
But if you look at it in those more than 30 years, he has some extraordinary opinions. His jurisprudence has been massively consequential. And most people, if you're not a lawyer, if you're not a constitutional lawyer, you probably don't know what Clarence Thomas's opinions have said. And so what I wanted to do in this book is talk about all three: his personal journey, his intellectual journey, but also the body of work that he has produced as one of the most consequential justices in history. And what I try to do in the book is what I try to do in the podcast, which is explain things in terms that are understandable, that are real. You don't have to be a lawyer to enjoy this book. You don't have to be a constitutional law expert any more than to listen to this podcast. You don't have to be an expert, or you don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be a foreign policy expert. I try to take issues that matter to you in your life, and I try to explain them with detail, with meat, with substance, but also in language that is understandable. And actually, I would say some of the philosophy of the book goes back to the philosophy of this Verdict podcast. When we just launched it, 5 years ago, when we started going on air, and the podcast went from the very first Verdict podcast was the first night of the first Trump impeachment, and I spent all day on the Senate floor in the jury of impeachment. Went over to the TV studio and recorded the inaugural verdict. And we did it every night at like midnight or 1 in the morning, assessing what happened. And I remember my production crew at the time, they said when we did the first few, their advice was dumb it down. They said, this is too sophisticated, too complicated. And I really resisted that. I said, listen, I don't believe that. I do not believe that people want dumbed down.
Yeah.
What they do want is understandable. And so the analogy that I've used many times is if you or I go to a doctor and we've got some horrible disease, nobody wants the doctor to say, Ben, you've got a boo-boo.
Yeah.
Like you're like, Doc, tell me what the hell's going on. But at the same time, you don't want the doctor to use a bunch of medical jargon that you have to have an MD to understand. So you want a serious and complicated issue explained in English in a way that you can follow it. That's what I try to do on this podcast. I try to explain all sorts of things. So during the first impeachment, that series of podcasts, I would explain, what is Ukraine?
Yeah.
What is Burisma, the natural gas company in Ukraine? What is impeachment? What are high crimes and misdemeanors? Just basic questions, but that if you're not an expert, there's no reason you should know. That worked, and the Verdict podcast went from 0 to it became the #1 ranked podcast in the world. With the book, I try to do the same thing, which is take really important and consequential issues before the Supreme Court, but explain it in a way that everyone can understand it. And I'll say, Ben, one thing that makes that much easier is that is also very much Justice Thomas's approach to writing opinions. That he
Exactly.
There are
his opinions, by the way. If you've never read a Justice Thomas opinion, when he was writing opinions and I was younger and it was big cases, I would always grab, if he wrote an opinion, whether it was in favor or against dissent, I would read it because I could understand exactly what he was saying. Whereas there's others on the Supreme Court, they write opinions, and if you're not a lawyer or a constitutional law geek, you do not understand exactly what they're saying.
He very much writes opinions that are plain, prose, understandable. There are justices who are renowned for highfalutin prose and tenpenny words, and at times you can't understand what the heck they're saying. Thomas believes every American ought to have a right to understand what the Supreme Court is saying, understand their Constitution, their rights, their Bill of Rights. I tell a story in the book about how he was visiting Gettysburg, and this fella comes up to him with an opinion printed on parchment, and it was an opinion. It was an admiralty opinion. It was not a high-profile opinion. It was not an opinion that was known by a lot of people. It was one Thomas has written, and he said, Justice Thomas, can you sign this for me? He said, sure. And he said, the fellow said, this is what it's all about. And Thomas looks at him confused, and he's like looking out over the battlefield at Gettysburg. He said, Gettysburg, this was all about an admiralty opinion? And the guy said, no. This, I can understand this. I can read it. I know what it's saying, and that's what the battle. We're the citizens. We should be able to understand our government. And that is very much consistent with how Justice Thomas tries to write his opinions, and it's how I try to write this book.
All right, I want to take a moment. I want to talk to you about where you spend your money. There are so many brands today that claim that they stand for quote-unquote American values, but most of the time it's all talk and no action. And that is what makes Patriot Mobile so different. I use Patriot Mobile, and for more than 12 years, Patriot Mobile has been living their values and standing in the gap for every American who believes freedom is worth fighting for. Now, their business was founded on a simple conviction. If culture is being shaped through commerce, then Americans deserve a real conservative alternative. And when you're talking about big mobile, well, they have big ideas, and they're with the left. Today, Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider. And you get premium priority nationwide service on any of the 3 major U.S. networks. With unlimited data plans and international roaming, 100% U.S.-based customer support, you get everything that you need. And besides the great tech, what truly sets Patriot Mobile apart is their mission. Every year, at no extra cost to you, Patriot Mobile contributes millions of dollars to organizations that are defending free speech, religious liberty, the sanctity of life, the Second Amendment, and America's future. Patriot Mobile isn't just sitting on the sidelines. They're on the front lines fighting for our freedoms. So if you have a cell phone, make the switch. Join the movement today and make a difference with every call you make. Go to patriotmobile.com/verdict. That's patriotmobile.com/verdict or 972-PATRIOT. And if you use the promo code VERDICT, you'll get a free month of service. That's patriotmobile.com/verdict or 972-PATRIOT and make that switch today. This book, one of the cool things about it is there's a couple really, I think, interesting points which readers will love when they read this book. And it goes back to not only the upbringing of Clarence Thomas, which you cover, and a lot of poverty, but also the fact, and got some headlines this week from the interview that you did on this podcast with him. Clarence Thomas has experienced two extreme forms of racism in his lifetime. The first was just racism because he was African American. The second form of racism was later in life, and that is where people assume because he was African American, he should believe or say certain things. And then when he went against that narrative of what they believed he should say because he's a black man, that was a second form of racism. And part of you thinks, well, I bet you didn't see that one coming when he was dealing with the first type of racism when he was younger.
Well, but in many ways he did. And you look at the two components. Let's start with his life story and racism directed against African Americans. Look, he was born in 1948, so just 3 years after World War II ends. And he was born in Pinpoint, Georgia, rural Georgia, on the coast of Georgia. Actually, English was not his first language. His first language was called Geechee, and it is a Creole dialect that is common on the Georgia and South Carolina barrier islands. In South Carolina, it's called Gullah, and Georgia, it's called Geechee. He was born and raised initially by a single mom who had a lot of issues and who struggled. They were in extreme poverty. They lived in a tenement that did not have indoor plumbing. He did not have a toilet in the house. They had an outhouse outside. They used a chamber pot, and he tells a story when he was a little boy, he was carrying a full chamber pot down the stairs, and he tripped and fell, and the whole thing dumped on him, and he was curled up in a ball at the base of the stairs, just drenched in stale urine. And I got to say, that is not a typical beginning for a Supreme Court justice.
Yeah.
From a young age, his mom was not able to care for him, so he ended up being raised by his grandparents. And his grandfather, Myers Anderson, who he called Daddy, was the most important and influential man in Clarence Thomas's life. And he was a hard man. He was a strict disciplinarian. The day Clarence and his brother moved into their grandparents' house, Myers Anderson said, "Boy, the damn vacation is over." and it says something like the life of squalor he was living in. Not many people would call that a vacation. Yeah. But Myers Anderson did. He believed in hard work, and he would work those boys. He would get them up at 3 or 4 in the morning, and they'd go with him delivering heating fuel. And they'd do it often in bitter early mornings in the winter when it was cold outside. And he would not let the boys wear gloves. He thought gloves were a sign of weakness, and you needed to be tough, you needed to be strong. And he would work them. He'd work them from before the sun came up till late at night. And at one point when he was a teenager, Clarence said to his grandfather, "Daddy, slavery is over." And without missing a beat, his grandfather said, "Not in this house, it's not." and he instilled discipline in those boys. The one exception, the one way they could get out of hard work, was reading in school. And both of Clarence Thomas's grandparents were illiterate. They couldn't read, they couldn't write. And they wanted their grandsons to have a better life. And so young Clarence Thomas would spend hours in the library just reading everything he could get his hands on and reading. He became a very good student. He still to this day devours books. And he was an excellent student. And as a young man, he decided he had found what he wanted to do in life. And it wasn't to be a lawyer. It wasn't to be a judge. He wanted to be a priest. His grandfather rather, was a very devout Catholic. And Clarence Thomas was raised as an altar boy. And he really loved the discipline, the ritual, the order, the structure of the Catholic Church. He loved and respected that the priests and nuns, that they cared for the community. The nuns who taught him in Catholic school had a really profound impact on his life, and so he decided, I'm going to be a priest. And he went to seminary, both in high school and college he went to seminary. And he encountered real racism in seminary. When he was in seminary in high school, he was one of only 2 black boys in the seminary. And he recounts a story of one of the white boys who was there passing him a note. And the note said, "I like Martin Luther King." And he remembers being surprised. He didn't expect him to say that. Yeah. And then he turned the paper over, and on the back it said, dead. And
Wow.
that really hit Clarence Thomas hard. And another instance, the kids in seminary would make fun of him. They would call him WBC, World's Blackest Child. One of the ways he responded to that was by excelling academically and proving himself. And so, for example, Latin, he became a very good Latin student, and he liked, again, the structure and order of Latin. And they had a competition, the Latin Bee, where you competed translating Latin, and he won it. He was the top Latin student at the school, and they gave him a prize. It was a statue of St. Jude. And he was really proud of that. And he put it in his dorm room. And the next day when he came, someone had broken the head off the statue. And so he went and got some glue, and he glued the head back on and set it back up on his bookcase. And the next day, someone had broken the head off again. And he glued it a second time, and it stuck after that. They didn't break it a third time. But when I went to interview him, and Justice Thomas agreed to sit for 9.5 hours of interviews in his chambers for this book. And so he and I went one-on-one. I'd come at 8 in the morning and sit down in chambers, and it was just him and me. I'd set down a tape recorder and just ask questions. One of the first questions I asked is I had heard about the statue of St. Jude, which he kept with him his whole life. And I said, "Hey, where's that statue? I'd really like to see it." And he kind of chuckled. He said, "Well, I don't have it anymore." And I said, "Well, what happened?" And he sent it to your friend and to my friend, Rush Limbaugh.
Wow.
Rush was a dear friend of his, and when Rush was sick, when Rush had cancer, Justice Thomas sent him the statue of St. Jude to give him comfort and peace as he was dying, and he never got it back from Rush. But it's kind of that statue was well served, comforting another great American hero, Rush Limbaugh.
All right, I do want to take a moment and talk to you about something that is just amazing. And if you're going to change someone's life, you want to know it actually lasts. That's one reason Compassion International has become one of the most trusted child development ministries in the world. Now, independent research shows children that are sponsored through Compassion stay in school longer, are 40% more likely to graduate from high school, and 80% more likely to finish college. That's because sponsorship isn't just temporary relief. It is a long-term investment through the local church. And they're meeting the physical needs while sharing the hope of Jesus. I am sponsoring a child at Compassion, and I can tell you it is phenomenal. And for just $43 a month, you can help shape a child's future as well. Sponsorship is so easy. To sponsor a child today, go to compassion.com. That's compassion.com, and make a difference in a child's life today. You know, there's so many people that are listening or watching this podcast, and they know Clarence Thomas as the guy who had to defend himself from horrific attacks during his confirmation hearing.
Yep.
There is so much about him that is not that. One of those is the fact that he was, as we mentioned earlier, a radical in school, and then there was a turning point.
Yes.
You got to talk about that as well.
Well, I did. After his high school seminary, he went to college seminary. And there, he ended up becoming disillusioned with the church, and he got angry at God. And he was disillusioned at the church because he thought the church was very slow to condemn racial discrimination, racial prejudice, that the church was slow to defend civil rights. And a point that I make in the book and that I discussed with Justice Thomas is look, that was true of the Catholic Church. It was true of the Protestant Church. It was true Christians as a whole were far too slow to stand up on the side of justice and condemn bigotry. And you know, Dr. Martin Luther King, many people forget that he was also Reverend King. He was a pastor. Yep. And when he wrote the letter from a Birmingham jail, and for several years I've gone to the Senate floor and participated in a bipartisan reading of the letter from a Birmingham jail, where you have Republicans and Democrats read it out loud, and it is so powerful. If we've all read it in school, but reading the words out loud just gives it additional weight and gravitas. But many people forget to whom that letter was addressed. Do you remember who it was addressed to, Ben?
I do not.
It was addressed to the clergy of America.
Wow.
And it was Reverend King saying to the pastors, to the priests, Stand up and fight for what's right. Do not be silent. And that my favorite line of that whole letter was Reverend King saying the church should be a thermostat and not a thermometer. We should be changing the temperature of our environment. We shouldn't just reflect what's around us. So Thomas becomes disillusioned. He becomes angry at God. He leaves seminary, and he leaves the church. He goes to Holy Cross for college and then Yale for law school. And for years, he refuses to attend Mass. I mean, he's really angry. He is now, once again, a very devout Catholic. He came back to God, came back to his faith, but it took many years. And when he was in college, when he was in law school, he went hard left, and he became a bitter, angry radical. He was mad at God. He was mad at the church. He was mad at America. He was mad at white men. And I will tell you, his leaving the seminary ruptured his relationship with his grandfather. His grandfather was adamant that when you do something, you don't quit. And when he quit, his grandfather threw him out of the house. And it may well be the single hardest chapter in Clarence Thomas's life when his grandfather, who he called Daddy, who raised him, the man he admired more than anyone else, threw him out. It was crushing to Clarence Thomas. And he was a radical. He wore camo pants and combat boots. He had a poster of Malcolm X on the wall. He would go to Black Panther rallies. He participated in a riot in Harvard Square.
Yeah.
He was a young, angry man in college.
You hear that part of the story, and this is where it goes back to faith. God used all of that to then turn him and probably prepare him for the biggest, I would say, personal attack we had ever seen publicly at that time on somebody either I think, in the political world, certainly trying to get on the Supreme Court, where the left decided we believe that this man is such a threat that we're going to try to stop him. And he was a threat on so many different levels. As a conservative African-American man, as someone that they understood by his age, he could serve for a very long time. We talked about that earlier. You've known him for a long time, but what are the takeaways now looking back on his confirmation hearing, and the whole world stopped, certainly all of America, to watch it, and some of the horrific things that were thrown at him trying to derail his confirmation. Now, others have had to deal with it since then. It was almost a playbook now by the left of if you want to get rid of somebody, I've heard it be said before by Democrats, we need to Clarence Thomas that nominee.
You're absolutely right. His confirmation hearing was brutal. It was a character assassination. It was, as he famously said on national television, it was a high-tech lynching for uppity Negroes. And I will tell you, those words silenced the Senate Judiciary Committee. In the book, I walk through the behind the scenes of that brutal confirmation hearing. They follow the same strategy that they did with Brett Kavanaugh. And I talk about that in the book, comparing the two. Obviously, Brett Kavanaugh was a very active part of that confirmation hearing. But in both instances, the Democrat senators had allegations of sexual assault or sexual harassment. They had them for weeks ahead of the hearing. They sat on them. They did nothing with them. They didn't ask the nominees about them. And then on the eve of the vote, they leaked them to the press and just smeared them in the press. By the way, Justice Thomas talks about the chairman of the Judiciary Committee during his hearing. That was Joe Biden, who Biden was deeply dishonest with him, said one thing to Thomas and then just broke his word and lied repeatedly. And it was, in both instances, Clarence Thomas was confirmed because the American people looked him in the eye in the hearing, and they looked Anita Hill in the eye, and by a 2-to-1 margin, 2/3 of Americans believed Clarence Thomas and did not believe Anita Hill's allegations. The same thing was true with Brett Kavanaugh. That's why he was confirmed. The book that I wrote, it begins with the following. Imagine a man who came from nothing, who endured bleak poverty, who stood up to crushing racism, who is right now on track to become the longest-serving Supreme Court justice in American history. You don't have to imagine. That man, of course, is the incomparable Clarence Thomas. There is nobody else quite like him. Somebody so extraordinary, you would think, would be venerated. And if he were politically liberal, he would be. Change that one small fact, and dozens of law schools would have given him an honorary degree. Elementary schools would be named after him. Late-night hosts would invite him on adoringly. And chic T-shirts, think Notorious RBG, would be aggressively marketed to young people. Instead, the response is silence and hate. It's time for that silence to end. I wrote this book because this man is a hero, and this is a time where we're so divided, we're so angry, we distrust each other so much, that we need heroes. We need role models.
Amen to that.
And I wrote this book because I admire Clarence Thomas, and I want people to know his story. And if you're looking for a role model in life, and if you're not, you should be, because we all need role models.
Yep.
It would be very hard for you to do better than Clarence Thomas. So I just want to ask our wonderful Verdict listeners, and you guys are the best and most passionate and engaged and informed group of Americans and patriots on planet Earth. If you haven't gone and bought the book, please go buy it. You will enjoy it. I'm promising you this is a fun read. You will learn, you will laugh, you will have insight for the same reason you listen to the podcast, because hopefully when you're done, you learn something that you didn't know when you sat down to it. The book will do the same. Go buy it, and I want to encourage you to give it to your loved ones. Give it to your kids or your grandkids or your brother or your mom or your dad. It's a Christmas gift. It's a birthday gift. I wrote this book because I want people to know this story. And there is nobody better than the Verdict listeners to ensure that people know the extraordinary hero. Know who the man is. You will read this book and you will understand and know Clarence Thomas in a very different way than you know him right now.
All right, don't forget, grab the book, and also don't miss a single episode of Verdict with Ted Cruz wherever you get your podcasts. We do the show Monday, Wednesday, Friday, so hit that subscribe or auto-download button, and the Senator and I will see you back here in a couple of days.